Today we continue our work on our way through Nehemiah. And this week I was sitting in my office, and Bill Brandamore comes in and had a suggestion for a song that we should do to introduce this sermon today. And he said that we should play "Nehemiah Was a Bullfrog." Apparently you think it's funnier than I did, but I'm just kidding. So we took under advisement, and that's right. First service I called him Brill Bandamore. So it's been one of those days. But last week Pastor Jan talked about the opposition that the people had faced in trying to rebuild this wall. And by the time this sermon series is over, I think it's actually going to take us longer to get through it than it did for them to actually build it, but I'm not sure. But Pastor Jan last week talked about how the opposition they were facing from their enemies outside, from other nations, caused them to actually have to work with a sword in one hand as they were building this wall for protection, because there was concern for their safety. And so each week we've kind of touched on this opposition that they have faced, and this week is no different. But it's a different kind of opposition that they faced, and we'll talk about it here in a moment. But if you have your Bibles, or if you want to pull out your pew Bible in front of you, we're on page 413 in Nehemiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. It'll be on the screen. You can pull out your Bible app. There's lots of different ways, but I encourage you to follow along with me this morning as we read. Now there was a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish kin. For there were those who said, "With our sons and our daughters, we are many. We must get grain so that we may eat and stay alive." There were also those who said, "We are having to pledge our fields, our vineyards, and our houses in order to get grain during the famine." And there were those who said, "We are having to borrow money on our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. Now our flesh is the same as that of our kindred. Our children are the same as their children. And yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been ravished. We are powerless, and our fields and vineyards now belong to others." I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. After thinking it over, I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, "You are all taking interest from your own people." And I called a great assembly to deal with them, and said to them, "As far as we are able, we have bought back our Jewish kindred who have been sold to other nations, but now you are selling your own kin, who must then be bought back by us." They were silent. I could not find a word to say. So I said, "The thing that you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations of our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us stop this taking of interest. Restore to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the interest on money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them." Then they said, "We will restore everything and demand nothing more from them. We will do as you say." And I called the priests and made them take an oath to do as they had promised. The problem this week centers on the complaints of the poor Jews against the wealthier Jews and the nobles. And they were either ignoring their desperate pleas, or were actually making those needs worse by exploiting them. They were taking advantage of them. Things were made even worse by famine that was happening, so that those who owned property were forced to mortgage their fields, vineyards, and houses in order to get food. Others had to borrow in order to pay the king's tax on their lands. Some were even forced to sell their children into slavery to their fellow Jews to pay their bills. And this was in total disregard of Mosaic law, which forbid a Jew from loaning money at interest to a fellow Jew in need. What was happening is the wealthier Jews were not only charging interest, but also taking Jewish children as slaves as collateral for the loans that they were making to them. They were operating as these heartless businessmen, putting their own financial gain as more important than their own people And they weren't taking into regard how it was hurting them and their families. I mean, they said, we need to eat. Nehemiah saw these problems that were happening, and he saw them as serious enough that he actually stopped work on the wall long enough to resolve these issues. And what was happening reminds me kind of about what Pastor Jan talked about last week. And she talked about willful blindness, which is where people are blind to something by choice. And I think she mentioned it's basically, if those of you that live in a house with children, it's people that, walking by that sink full of dishes, walking by that hamper full of laundry, or that, that piece of trash on the floor, or that full garbage can. It's something like that. And it can be a conscious or unconscious choice, which sometimes it's either we purposely miss it or we just become so used to it that we just kind of ignore it. And a lot of times this is really something that we see right now with social media, I think makes it worse, because we're so bombarded with some of these images that now we just sort of scroll right by them and ignore them. We see it a lot with violence and the things that's happening and people that are in need and some of those sorts of things, as we just we're becoming conditioned against them so that they don't really stand out to us anymore. So a situation like this actually happened to me. I lived in Philly for a while and was used to people coming up and asking for money. We had a food pantry, and it really jaded me during my time there. And so we were actually a couple years ago in Atlantic City on a little mini vacation one summer, and I completely ignored somebody that was panhandling, kind of walking along the street asking for money. And after we walked by, my wife laid into me for it, and I felt guilty. And so I actually doubled back to try to talk to the person, and they were gone. So we ended up going an hour or two later to a craft show, and I found that actually the homeless shelter was there collecting, and so I went up and told them the story and gave them money. But we do this when we see somebody panhandling or asking for money, or we know somebody that's in need. It's like, oh gosh, here they go again. It's that person again. And we become conditioned against the plight of another or something, these things that are happening. And it becomes really, really easy to do. It becomes easy to see or hear another person in need, but just pretend like they don't exist, or make an excuse for why we're not helping them. And this is what was happening with the wealthy people and the nobles in Jerusalem, is they were turning a blind eye to the plight of those around them, their own people. And it's even worse, is they weren't only ignoring their pleas, is they were actually making it worse by charging interest in all of this and taking their children when they would give them a loan. Think about it this way. Everybody here's probably bought a car at one point in time or another. Can you imagine going to the car dealership, getting a loan, and then having to leave one of your kids there? Some of you are probably like, oh, thank God. But no, just kidding. But could you imagine you're having to leave one of your children at the car dealership and giving them over to the bank for that collateral? Now, some of you, I've seen your cars, it's probably an arm and a leg had to be left there, but not one of your children. But this morning, this message could probably go 50 different directions because of what is in it. But I want to focus this morning on the example of leadership that we see from Nehemiah in the middle of this. Because he was facing opposition constantly every time he turned around. And this time, the opposition that they're facing is from the inside. And what I like about what Nehemiah did is that Nehemiah faced this head on. He didn't push it down the road. He didn't ignore it. He didn't sweep it under the rug. He didn't tell people to get over it. He dealt with the situation. But sometimes we do this in organizations and in churches and businesses as we know there's an issue, but we sort of ignore it. We push it off on somebody else, or we just hope it'll go away, and we don't deal with it. Sometimes we even do this in our personal relationships and families, and we sort of ignore the elephant in the room, if you will. But that elephant never goes away. And this is actually, and Pastor Jan mentioned it last week, this is sort of what our denomination is facing right now with this special gathering of the Way Forward, this special conference session, is that it's been an issue that's sort of been the elephant in the room for a long time, and we've never gotten around to deal with it, and we've kept pushing it down the road, and here we are. And the problem is when you push those things down the road is by the time you get around to those things, that elephant kind of grows. And I think that's what happened to us, and I think that's what happens too, is when we put that off, is by the time you get to that elephant has gotten a lot bigger than it needed to be if you would have just dealt with it the first time. And so that's what Nehemiah does. And Nehemiah dealt with it. But Nehemiah, the reason it was an issue too was not only did Nehemiah see what was going on within the people, Nehemiah saw how other people were looking in on them because of this issue. And that's the same thing that happens in businesses and churches and in our lives and our relationships, is when we don't deal with something internally, it becomes visible externally. When we don't deal with something on the inside, the next thing you know, people on the outside see it. So right now, for our denomination, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but right now, because of what we're dealing with, the world is watching. Because that's what happened. And so these people at this time with Nehemiah were seeing this internal strife that was happening, and they saw how they were treating each other, and they knew that it was creating issues, and there was unrest and turmoil. And if you're a warring nation, and you see that internal unrest, you're looking at them and you're like, boy, they're ripe for the picking, because they can't even get it together, so how could they fend us off if we wanted to attack them? And Nehemiah knew this. So what happened is when these people came to Nehemiah with this issue, Nehemiah realized that their plight was affecting everything about them. It was affecting their work on the wall. It was affecting their morale. It was affecting their very well-being and their lives. And so Nehemiah hit this head on. And he said, after thinking it over, I brought charges against the nobles and the officials, and I said to them, you are taking interest from your own people. And I called a great assembly to deal with them. Nehemiah knew this was a big issue, and so Nehemiah brought the community together to deal with the community issue. And he decided that he was going to stop it. So he went to the nobles, and some people think that he probably went to the nobles, didn't get anywhere, and then that's why he called this assembly, because that's kind of the biblical thing for confrontation and how you're supposed to deal with an issue. Is you go to the person, and if that doesn't work, then you sort of bring more people in. And they believe that's probably why he did it. And it was so important that even though Nehemiah was hurrying to get his wall done, he thought it was such a big deal and it was affecting things that he was willing to stop everything, call everybody together, and deal with it. So it had to have been a big issue. But see, what we see from Nehemiah is that he was in a position of power, and he used that power to help others. Nehemiah could have put this off on somebody else. Nehemiah could have said, I'll get over it. But Nehemiah knew that he had a position of power. He knew that he was their leader, and he knew he needed to address it. And so notice what the people say to Nehemiah in verse 5 towards the end. They say, now our flesh is the same as that of our kindred. Our children are the same as their children, and yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been ravished. We are powerless. We are powerless, and our fields and vineyards now belong to others. See, these people came to Nehemiah because they felt like they had no power, and Nehemiah did. They felt like they were not in a position to do anything, and they felt hopeless. When you're powerless, you feel hopeless because you feel like you can't do anything. You feel like it's out of your control. And so they come to Nehemiah to address it. Now, what I know of Aldersgate and of this church is that this is a church of influence. And I don't just mean here. I mean, this church has people that serve some pretty important positions in our community and your communities. And I want to ask, as leaders and as influencers, I want to ask you a question this morning. Are you using your position of power and influence to help those who are powerless? Are you using your position of power to help the people that don't have power, that work under you, that answer to you? Are you using your position of power to help them? Are we aware even of the needs of those who are around us, those who are hurting and struggling? Are we connected to them, and are we speaking up for them, and are we doing things to sort of help them have hope? Mary Kay Ash, who was the founder of Mary Kay Cosmetics, once said, "We need leaders who add value to the people in the organization they lead, who work for the benefit of others and not just for their own personal gain. Leaders who inspire and motivate, not intimidate and manipulate. Who live with people to know their problems in order to solve them, and who follow a moral compass that points in the right directions regardless of trends." Nehemiah had a connection to his people. The people were comfortable enough that they could go to Nehemiah with this concern, and they knew that Nehemiah would listen to them. And Nehemiah had such a connection to them that in verse 6 we see Nehemiah's reaction. He says, I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. He felt for his people so much that when he heard this was happening, he was mad. But see, we always see anger as a negative emotion. It's a bad thing. Don't get angry. Ephesians 4:27 actually says, in your anger, do not sin. But notice that Nehemiah did not act immediately on his anger. But he says, after thinking it over, Nehemiah got mad, but Nehemiah didn't react. Nehemiah got mad, and then Nehemiah thought about it a little bit. Some would probably call Nehemiah's anger righteous anger. If you were a fan of the old Batman TV show and you know who Burt Ward is, he would probably call this holy anger. He would call it, an anger that can be used to make a change. It's anger that spurred Nehemiah to act on something. Have you ever gotten so angry at something that something's made you so mad that you knew that you had to do something about it? That you had to make a change? It could be with yourself, it could be with your family, it could be with your job. Have you ever gotten so mad at something, like something has angered you so much that you knew you had to be the one that make that change? That's righteous anger. But again, Nehemiah didn't let his anger cause him to lose control. He didn't lash out. And I'll be honest, I think this is something our world really needs to work on right now. Right now, we see people getting angry about certain issues, and it could be a political, social, religious, or whatever else, and they're getting angry about it, and instead of thinking about it, they're just blah. They're just lashing out in their anger. They're letting it take over, and they're letting themselves lose control, and they're saying and doing things that completely go against the point they're trying to make. Whenever you're trying to change something, name-calling, hatred, violence, none of these things are the right way to go about making change. Because negative actions will not create positive change. I learned this as a parent. Negative actions will not create positive change. You can't get something to change by acting in a negative manner. So Nehemiah thinks this over for a bit, and he comes up with a plan, and he calls the assembly and he confronts the people that were in the wrong. And he points out that they've worked so hard as a community to get their fellow kin out of slavery to other nations, but then now they're taking these same people and put them back into slavery. It's just they're the slave owners now. And how do they respond when they're called sort of to the mat, if you will, when they're confronted? It said they were silent and could not find a word to say. You ever gotten busted? And you're just like, yeah. I've done it. They couldn't find a word to say. They knew that they were in the wrong. So Nehemiah goes on and says to them, and I love how he says this, the thing that you were doing is not good. That's pretty blunt. But then he goes on and he says, shouldn't you be walking in fear of your God? Because what they were doing was against the Mosaic law. He's saying, you're doing this thing, and not only is it wrong because these are your own people, but God's not going to be happy either. But then he goes on and he says that because of the way you're acting, it's creating taunts from our enemies. Because they're looking, and we keep saying that God is with us and God is doing this, and yet you're acting against God. And he ends this by telling them that he and others had actually been lending to the poor. So when you talk about Nehemiah's leadership, Nehemiah was so connected to his people that him and the people that were under him were actually stepping up to fill this. They were helping give them food, they were helping give them money, and they were trying to help keep them afloat because of the actions that their own people were doing. I guess it would be the same as people that have to step up even in our own nation and kind of fill in the gap because other people are being taken care of, or being taken advantage of, rather, from a third party. And so Nehemiah confronts them, and the people repent. And see, what we see is that there was this issue affecting the community, so Nehemiah, through his leadership, brought the community together to rectify this community issue. And the people realized that what they were doing was wrong. And so then Nehemiah, for good measure, is like, let's get the priests in here. And so he has them take an oath in front of the people and in front of the priests. And then I didn't actually include it today, but Nehemiah in the next verse, in verse 13, shakes out his robe, which is basically saying that, all right, if you violate this oath, may God take everything away from you. So he's basically saying that you made this oath now, and if you're not true to it, oh, you're in trouble. But see, again, what we see here is that Nehemiah, as their leader, was setting this good example. He wasn't telling other people to do this. He wasn't ordering other people around. Nehemiah himself was dealing with the issue. And through this, he showed exceptional leadership. He didn't back down, but he didn't threaten or bully them either. He didn't sort of, I guess, beat around the bush, if you will. He went straight at it, and he just told them, this is wrong. What you were doing is wrong. Nehemiah had authority, and he used it to help people who didn't have power or authority. But he also didn't misuse the power and authority he had. He didn't force them. He confronted them, and they changed it. But I think that me and Nehemiah then listening to the whole community and listening to the people and approaching those people was extremely important. And the entire time, Nehemiah focused on God's law, what was right in God's eyes. And chapter 5 actually ends with Nehemiah saying, remember for my good, O God, all that I have done for the people. Nehemiah is saying to God, remember me, God, I'm trying to do what's right. Nehemiah followed God the entire time. And so then we see when we move to chapter 6 that in 52 days the wall was completed. It says, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all of our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own self-esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Amen. All of their enemies, all of their opposition were now afraid of them because they saw God working through Nehemiah and among the people. So we go from these enemies sort of looking in on the unrest inside this community to when it's done, they're looking at them and saying, whoa. And I love the part that it says that they were so taken aback by it that they fell greatly in their self-esteem. Could you imagine that? Because of what Nehemiah and the people accomplished with God's help, all of their enemies that thought that they had a chance to go against them were knocked down a couple pegs. Wouldn't it be nice if the people that maybe opposed you or maybe people that you sort of struggled with in a relationship with, or wouldn't it be nice if people looked at you and your life and were so taken aback at how God was working in your life that it kind of affected how they felt about themselves? To where they were like, wow, look what God is doing through them. God's really moving through them. And it wouldn't be great if they saw that and were so taken aback with how God's working in your life that they looked at you and they're like, I want that. Can you imagine what would happen as a church or a denomination if people saw that? If out of this special general conference, if people looked at the church and if we come out of this following God's will in the right way, that if other people looked at us and said, man, that's a church that really follows God's will for them. This morning, if you are in leadership, I'm going to ask you, what do you rely on in your life? As leaders, and even as pastors, I've seen it, I've struggled with it, others have as well. Sometimes if you're in leadership, it's easy to sort of rest on your own abilities, isn't it? It's easy to rest on your personality or your accomplishments or your knowledge or your speaking ability or your education or your experience or even your title or, that nameplate on your desk or on your door. But the thing is, if we're leading and we're not allowing God to help us, then what are we really doing? If we are leading and we're not in touch with the people we're leading, and if we're not caring about them, and if we're not listening to them, if we're not dealing with conflict and we're letting them struggle, are we really leading? And if we're leading and we're not really making a difference in this world and in somebody's life or in the grand scheme of things, why are we doing it? So we can throw some money in the bank and pay a couple bills and drive a nice car? John Maxwell shares this following quote. It's from an unknown person. And he shares at the beginning of his 20 irrefutable laws of leadership. And Maxwell writes, "He who leads and no one follows is simply taking a walk." He who leads and no one follows is simply taking a walk. So who is following you this morning? Who are you leading? And I don't care what it is that you do for a career or in life, somebody is looking to you, and you may not realize it. Somebody at work or at home, at school, at church, in the community. There's a great chance that you are leading somebody. But I think the most important question is, who are you following?